Okay, welcome everyone. We are going to be talking about personality. And so, starting off from a little bit of what we learned last week about the self, before we can really talk about our personalities, we have to talk about self. So, just to review, collectivistic and individualistic cultures view the self differently. So, in turn, personality and personality characteristics may be interpreted differently across cultures. Collectivists value social roles and personal relationships. Individualists value individual rights and freedom of expression. Okay, let's see if it's gonna go. Okay, so what is personality? Personality is this concept of long-standing traits and patterns, so patterns of behavior, that propel individuals to consistently think, feel, and behave in specific ways. It's kind of a way to think about it is like a stimulus and a response. And if you keep getting the same stimulus and then responding the same way, it becomes a habit. And then perhaps if you come across a similar stimulus from that original stimulus, maybe you will respond in the same way as that other stimulus. And this becomes kind of a pattern of behavior. And some of these are thinking patterns that can lead to toxicity, like toxic thinking patterns, which we'll get into later, but more so it's maybe reaffirming your belief system. And if you come across a type of behavior that aligns with your belief system, then you continue in that belief system, and you know, the more positive reinforcement you get to continue these traits and behavior patterns, the more likely you are to continue in that way. But there's this idea that there are a couple of behaviors that are really ingrained in us, and from a very young age, we learn them and then we kind of stick with them. Okay. So, personality is the characteristic or ways that people differ from one another. Um, so, for example, I have a very maybe more neurotic personality than my significant other. That is because I have been through a lot of personal things that happened in my life, major events that kind of put a kind of a trigger on certain situations, while my significant other has had uh, a pretty good life in that there hasn't been anything remarkably traumatic to happen. And in that way, he is more open and outgoing and very accepting of, people's word as it is. While for me, I may be more suspicious, more cautious. And this is just the development of our environment. So we had different environments growing up. We had different ways of reacting to situations. And this in turn forms our personality. Okay. So when we use terms such as talkative, quiet, active, or anxious, we are using words to describe a personality. And so when someone works in the personality field of psychology, they're trying to figure out what are some main traits that people hold. What are some universal things that people across cultures kind of hold and have happen, particularly if they grow up in a type of environment that makes it easier for these personalities to occur. Okay. And the personality traits is that concept that people differ in certain areas. So, for example, I'm more anxious, while my significant other is more doesn't really get anxious very often, very calm, very, at peace with his decisions and all of that. And I see that as two different sides of the spectrum. So, I fall more on that, yet again, neurotic side, while he falls more on that kind of cheerful, happy, positive thinking side. And another example would be maybe being extroverted versus introverted, maybe thriving in an environment where others are around you and you can kind of take in their energy. While for introverts, a lot of times being around others kind of saps their energy, kind of takes away their energy sources, so they have to go and resupply. While extroverts, they may thrive on it and in fact get more energy from being around other people. Okay, so here is just a very basic 3 criteria of what makes a personality characteristic an actual trait, so something, a long-standing behavior. The first is that it is consistent. It is consistent across where you live, at home, the relationships you have at home. When you go to work, this is the same characteristics you take to work. It's in public, people in public can clearly see it, or it's in private, and it's your kind of is available and accessible through all aspects of your life. So, for example, some people have very different personas for their work and their home life. And it doesn't mean that one is not more authentic than the other. It just means that people kind of have this self-monitoring, and they turn on certain things when they're with certain people, or they turn it off. But with a trait, it is uniform across all of these different personas. So, for example, high empathy levels. If someone has high empathy levels, they are going to showcase that at home, in work, in the public, in private. And if people are more introverted, they may show that introversion more so when they're in public situations or at work, while at home it might be a little less because they feel, they don't feel as drained when they're around others in their home life or in their private life. Okay, stability. This is the idea that this characteristic or trait is consistent. So you develop it, it becomes a part, kind of a trademark, a way people describe you. When you have that job interview and they ask, what are 3 ways coworkers would describe you, or 3 traits your coworkers would say you would have? Maybe agreeableness, or being conscious of others, or empathy. And the idea is that this question can be answered the same way across your age because it's a stable trait. And then lastly, there's this idea of individual differences. So people do differ on how frequently they talk and how active they are. So talkativeness as an individual difference and activity level do exist. So just these fine-tuned differences, you may say, oh, Ben and Jill are both extroverted, but Ben is more extroverted in these sorts of situations, or Jill is more extroverted in these types of situations. So they have maybe individual differences where they vary on levels. Okay. So one of the big, I don't want to say problems, but maybe concerns of identifying personality traits has been coming up with accurate descriptors. So we need something that encompasses this single trait and doesn't overreach onto other traits, and is unique in that setting. So there are certain words that are similar. So for example, friendly and sociable. There isn't too much of a difference. Maybe you would use it in different circumstances, but these traits are very similar. All right, so let's continue on. Sorry, it's my dogs. They always seem to try to talk to me when I'm trying to do work. So we have to cover Freud when we were talking about personality. Freud actually came up with this concept of personality And it stems from his idea on consciousness and how consciousness, we have kind of this unconscious part of ourself and our more conscious part of ourself, and how these intersect. So our id is this more unconscious wants, needs, desires. I want to do that now. Our very basic needs. So, our sex drive, our pleasure-seeking activities, things that, if we were, 3 years old and we say, I want to do this, I want to do that, kind of that same personality, or that same type of person in us, in a 40-year-old who is trying to, maybe do the right thing, or understand that they can't do this one thing that they want to do right now. So it's often seen as kind of that little devil on the shoulder. And then the superego is kind of seen as the angel on the shoulder. So it's their more ethical side. It's not right to do that. You should be considerate of others. You should think about others. And then these two characteristics combine to form our ego. And this is what we act out in the world around us. Maybe we can compromise. Maybe we can have some of our desires, such as wanting ice cream. And because we are with a group of people, maybe you ask everyone to, if they want some ice cream, then you buy everyone ice cream. So kind of that combination of the two characteristics. This is a very simplistic way of explaining it, but you don't really have to know much more than that. Okay, the 5-factor model. This is how personality psychologists figured out how to define certain traits of personality, and kind of broke it down into these 5 key categories. So the first is openness. The next is conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. So we will go through each of these accordingly. I'll kind of go briefly through them, and I just want you guys to get familiar with it. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and talk about the traits. So openness. So it's the tendency to appreciate new things, new ideas, new values, new feelings, new behaviors. They may engage in getting different types of haircuts and body piercing. Maybe likes art or poetry or creating things. And maybe open to various values and beliefs. Maybe they enjoy different religions. Maybe they go to a different church every week because they like to, take in different religions. Or maybe, they have different spiritual interests as a whole. So a person who is lower in openness may often be very stuck in their ways, or have very solid foundations of beliefs. There's nothing wrong with that, but that is kind of the opposite of openness. So is not so willing to take on new ideas, but very comfortable in the ideas that they hold. Conscientiousness. So this is someone who is competent in their job, very orderly, always on time, dutiful, achievement-oriented, looking to fulfill that next goal, very self-disciplined. Maybe they wake up in the morning, go for a run, come home, knock out some chores, etc., and very deliberate in the actions that they do. Now, that's not to say that they do this every day or have this concept every day, but the idea that underlying personality trait of wanting to get up and do things and start the day and get things done, those sorts of mentalities. So someone high in conscientiousness will be rarely late for a date or appointment, maybe persevering in tough times, punctual, self-disciplined. Someone who is low in conscientiousness may prefer spur-of-the-moment action to planning, maybe a little bit more careless. Yet again, it doesn't mean it's a bad thing if you're not conscientious. It just, there's many levels of it. It kind of exists on a continuum. All these traits do. So maybe you align with being self-disciplined, but not so much in keeping everything orderly, or vice versa. So it can be very, can alter or change as time goes on. Okay. Extroversion. So this is when someone is gregarious. And in case you don't know, gregarious is like talkative, outgoing. Gregarious is a GRE word. So just to let you know, that is a word that they like to use on the GRE. So think of it as someone who's very open and happy and likes to have a crowd, maybe a speaker or show host or, whatever it may be. Someone who is warm, is extroverted, assertive, active in their life and their community, excitement seeking. So maybe someone who likes to go skydiving or, likes to race cars or shoot guns, whatever it may be, getting that thrill of excitement and being positive emotionally. So people in high extroversion may be the life of the party. They thrive on it. While those low in extroversion may prefer a quiet night to a party, or can also, someone who is low in extroversion may be seen as unenthusiastic, but in fact they just may not show it. That's a big part of our culture, is that we show our feelings on our face, and maybe culturally they don't want to do that, or they just, don't show, maybe they have more self-monitoring skills and they don't show that characteristic of themselves. Okay, agreeableness. So agreeableness is the tendency to agree and go along with others rather than to assert one's own opinions and choices. So people who are agreeable are often agreeable about political affiliations or opinions, acknowledging the truth in everyone's own beliefs, good-natured, forgiving, helpful. Someone who is low in agreeableness may be harder to, may assert that their opinions are the only correct ones, maybe a little more assertive, maybe a little bit more stringent on their beliefs. While someone who is agreeable can really see the sides, all the different sides of the situation, and maybe don't have their own center of their own center of belief, like this is 100% true in what I believe in. More so, there's multiple gray areas. There's multiple situations in which you might do something differently than what you believe you would do. Okay. And the last one is neuroticism. This is someone who's maybe a little bit more anxious, maybe experience anger, some depression, self-consciousness. This is huge. So a lot of mental health disorders stem from this idea of having the trait of neuroticism or being high neuroticism, in particular being more anxious and depressed, and also self-conscious. So someone who isn't confident in themselves, maybe call themselves ugly or fat or whatever it may be. Someone who's a little bit more impulsive, perhaps, and someone who is just, on the whole, maybe more vulnerable. Maybe they share too much. Maybe they're kind of an open book. They might be worried about little things often and may believe that they are inadequate. Okay. All right, so there are some traits beyond the 5-factor model or the ocean model that we just reviewed. The Eysenck emphasis, which I think you guys read about, Hexaco, Machiavellicism, need for cognition, optimism, self-esteem, narcissism. So all these things are different ways of capturing behavior that are different from the 5-factor. Okay, so going back to Freud, we have to talk about where personality began. How does it begin? What concepts or theories do we have? And because Freud was really the beginning of all the psychological theories, he of course came up with theory about personality development. So he believed that children had different times in which they focused on a certain area of the body, and if any of these zones or erogenous zones were not completed, I would say completed or were not realized to their full potential, then the child could get stuck in this specific erogenous zone and can have maybe a mental health or a mental illness or a type of personality trait because of you not moving through that phase. Okay, most of Freud's ideas have not found support in modern research, but the consensus is that the importance of childhood experiences, that the experiences you have in childhood have a lasting influence, especially on your personality. So, for example, and I'm not gonna take too long on this because we have other good theorists that we can review. But if someone is fixated on the oral stage of their growth, so someone who maybe as a child sucks his fingers or, receives milk, whatever it may be, if the child feels that is not adequately taken care of during that time, maybe the pacifier is taken away, there might become a fixation on this oral concept, and perhaps when the child grows up, they have an eating disorder or they are addicted to food. So he kind of made this far-reaching idea of certain stages can affect certain areas of the body, and these certain areas of the body can affect certain traits. Like I said, not a lot of support. So I just wanted to have you all be aware of this, and we will move forward. Okay. So here's just another idea of, or another way to conceptualize Freud's concepts. So if someone does not successfully wean off of breastfeeding or formula, it may lead to smoking or overeating in adulthood. If the child is not properly toilet trained, they may have orderliness issues or messiness issues. So right here it says if all stages were successfully completed, then the person should be sexually matured and mentally healthy. Okay. So personality and assessment, this is a notion that came about in the 1960s. Walter Mischel published a book called Personality and Assessment, and Mischel suggested that if one looks closely at people's behaviors across many different situations, consistency often falls short. In other words, kids who cheat on tests may steadfastly follow all rules and games and never lie to parents. And so what he's trying to say is that the situational factors may be the primary determinant of behavior. And kind of that broad personality traits like honesty may be more of an illusion. So what he means is that perhaps an individual is introverted in all situations except when they are at a college party. Then maybe they become extroverted and it becomes easier for them to experience, different things. And so their trait kind of changes based on that situation. So after many years of debate, there's some agreement that those situation personality factor into behavior. So the effect of the situation is about as large as that as the personality traits. So, and it's kind of vice versa. Personality traits can kind of carry across different situations. So that is why when we do personality studies, we have to have multiple studies of the same thing and try to categorize it as closely as possible. Try to categorize the behaviors as closely as possible to the descriptor word, so that we can figure out if this is a trait that is consistent across situations, or if it changes based on situations, or whatever else it may be. Okay, so here is some defense mechanisms that people often put into place, and I'm talking about them now because it is part of our personality, how we maybe diffuse situations, or maybe not accept information. So, for example, people who engage in repression, maybe are not very confrontational. So pushing away thoughts about my husband who's cheating, pushing away thoughts about my child who is failing school, and so maybe that person is a little less confrontational. Denying the issue, regression, perhaps returning to childlike behavior. Perhaps the person is more self-centered, turning to childlike behavior. Maybe they had a trauma in their past. Reaction formation, opposite of your true reaction or feelings. We have projection, rationalization, and displacement. So you just have to become familiar with these. Go ahead and write them down. I'm pretty sure they're going to be on the quiz. And if you have any questions, just let me know. I'm going to go on to the next slide. So there are some learning approaches to personality. So for behaviorists, the behaviorist view, remember Skinner and Watson, and stimulus and response. So personality is shaped by reinforcements and consequences. So reinforcements such as things to encourage behavior, and consequences such as punishments. So if a child goes to school and earns A's, maybe their parents say, hey, every time you earn an A, you get $100. So then they become more studious, and they have this characteristic of being intelligent, smart, going to school, applying themselves. And some of it could be because they get that $100 if they get an A in this class. So, or vice versa, it could be consequences. If you do not pass this class, then you have to pay the tuition. So people behave in a consistent manner based on prior learning. So you may see some people, they went to private school, and they had a strict dress code. Perhaps because of that strict dress code, when they go to college, they wear a lot of the same clothes, or maybe they're the exact opposite, and they, because of the constant harassing of wearing the same clothes every day, they kind of dye their hair, wear eccentric clothes. So our behavior and our personality is shaped by the consequences of our behavior. Then we have social cognitive. This is when personalities develop through learning, which may be observational. Observational learning is when we watch others and we pick up on their characteristics. And for example, if a family is eating in the dining room, and the child constantly sees the dad yelling at the mom, maybe the child then goes to kindergarten and starts yelling at his classmates, particularly his female classmates. So maybe he learned to be a bit of a bully through his father. And so this idea of monkey see, monkey do. What we see is something that we take in, interpret, and then kind of project out. So both learning and cognition are sources of individual differences in personality. Okay. Here are a couple of different personality assessment tests. We have the Rorschach-Inkfaltz test, MMPI, and I think that's all of the tests that I have here. So you just need to be familiar that these tests exist. Yeah, MMPI personality test. This is something that jobs may have you take, or you may take because of the class sees the different personality characteristics, etc. Okay, so a little bit about the social cognitive theory. It was developed by Bandura, and I'm trying to pull this up. Okay. So he proposed this idea of reciprocal determinism, so that our behavior, cognitive processes, and situation context all influence one another. So we behave in a certain way, it affects our situation. And then our situation can affect the cognitive factors. And then the cognitive factors can affect our behavior. So I want you guys to think about that and try to think of an example in which a behavior shaped a situation, or a situation shaped kind of how you thought about it, and how the cognitive factors affect behavior. All right, this is all that I'm going to do for today. Sorry about the dogs in the recording. I appreciate all of you, and I will talk to you